The defendant who outsmarted the court. The tension in the Los Angeles County Courthouse was thick, almost suffocating. Every seat in the gallery was filled, spectators murmuring in hushed voices as they watched something they had never seen before. At the defendant's table stood a young man who barely looked old enough to vote, hands in his pockets, shoulders squared. Not defiant, but steady, confident. Too confident for someone facing serious charges. Jalen Dawson, 19th grand theft auto, resisting arrest. Judge Walter Grayson peered over his glasses, his lips twisting into a smirk. He had seen hundreds of kids like Jalen before, reckless, scared, in over their heads. He leaned back, fingers drumming against his desk. "You think you're some kind of legal expert?" Grayson's voice carried dry amusement. "This isn't a debate club, kid." A few quiet chuckles rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff, the stenographer, even the prosecutor. They had already decided how this would go. But Jalen wasn't laughing. He had spent his whole life preparing for this moment. Not this exact moment. He never planned to be standing here as a defendant, but the courtroom was as familiar to him as his own home. While other kids memorized basketball stats, Jalen memorized case law. While his friends played video games, he played mock trials in his head. His mother had worked as a paralegal for over 20 years, and he had grown up listening to stories of how the system worked, and more importantly, how it failed. Prosecutors cutting corners, judges playing favorites, defense attorneys who barely tried. He saw it all, and he learned. Grayson sighed, flipping open the case file. "Let's make this quick. I have a golf game at 2. The audience chuckled again, but Jalen's lips curled into the faintest smirk. The judge had just made his first mistake. And no one had noticed. The prosecutor, Mitchell Carrington, rose from his seat. He was the kind of man who had never lost a case. And it showed in the way he walked, the way he spoke, the way he barely glanced at Jalen before addressing the court. "Your Honor, the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant was caught red-handed in a stolen vehicle. A 2022 Audi A6, reported missing just hours before his arrest. Officers pursued him through downtown, where he allegedly attempted to flee before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The evidence speaks for itself." The words landed heavily. A stolen car. A chase. Running. It sounded airtight. Judge Grayson nodded. "Go on." Carrington walked toward the jury box, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. "The defense may try to convince you that this was all a misunderstanding, that Mr. Dawson is some unfortunate victim of circumstance." He turned, locking eyes with Jalen for the first time. "But let's be honest, what kind of victim runs from the police?" The courtroom went still. Jalen didn't blink. Carrington flipped through his papers. "Your Honor, I have here the testimony of Officer Daniel Ruiz, who personally witnessed the defendant behind the wheel before he attempted to flee." Judge Grayson glanced at Jalen as if expecting him to crack. Instead, Jalen tilted his head slightly, and then he spoke for the first time. "I move to dismiss that testimony." A ripple of confusion swept through the room. Grayson squinted. "On what grounds?" Jalen pulled his hands from his pockets, finally stepping forward. "Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that car." Carrington scoffed. "That's in his report." "Then I'd like to submit a request to verify his GPS logs from that night." Jalen's voice was steady. "If his report is accurate, his location history will prove it. But I have a feeling it won't." The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Grayson turned to Carrington. "Does the prosecution have any issue with verifying the officer's GPS logs?" A pause. Just long enough. The jury noticed, the gallery noticed, and most importantly, Grayson noticed. Carrington's jaw tightened. "No objections, Your Honor." But the shift had already begun. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't laughing. Carrington straightened his tie, trying to regain control. "Your Honor, while we wait for the GPS records, the fact remains that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the stolen vehicle." Jalen nodded. "That's true." A flicker of surprise crossed Carrington's face. But let's talk about that. Jalen turned to the jury. The prosecution wants you to believe that fingerprints on a car mean I stole it. That's their entire argument. But let's think about this logically. His voice was calm, steady. Say you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You put your hands in the pockets, zip it up, then put it back on the rack. Hours later, someone shoplifts that jacket. Would the fact that your fingerprints are on it mean you stole it? Silence. A few jurors exchanged glances. Jalen didn't give them time to recover. The car was parked outside a 7-Eleven hours before the alleged theft. I was inside that store with friends. When we walked past, I leaned against the car. I even opened the door. It was already unlocked. Dumb. Yes. A crime. No. He let that sit. Does touching something make you a criminal? The courtroom was so silent you could hear a heartbeat. Carrington was flipping through his notes now, searching for something, anything. Jalen wasn't finished. And while we're on the topic, was the forensic specialist from this case subpoenaed to testify? Grayson blinked. Excuse me. Jalen turned to the judge. The person who processed this so-called evidence. Were they called to court? Grayson glanced at Carrington. The prosecutor hesitated. No. Jalen's lips pressed together. So the state is using forensic evidence to try and convict me, but didn't think it was necessary to bring in the person who actually handled that evidence. Carrington's jaw tightened. Interesting. And then, Jalen dropped the bombshell. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the owner of the vehicle. Grayson frowned. The owner? Jalen nodded. Raymond Whitaker, the registered owner of the stolen Audi. He told the police something that was never submitted in the prosecution's filings, and I think I know why. He pulled out a printed transcript and read. I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off, but it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid, and he was white. The courtroom exploded. Carrington's face turned pale. Grayson rubbed his temples. The case had just collapsed. Silence. Then, case dismissed. Chaos. Reporters scrambling. The gallery in uproar. But Jalen just stood there, letting it all sink in. As he walked out, Judge Grayson called after him. Mr. Dawson. Jalen stopped. You should consider law school. Jalen smirked. I already have. Because next time, he wouldn't be the defendant. He'd be the attorney. And when that day came, he wouldn't be the only one. If this story made you think, share it. Because next time, it might not be Jalen. It might be someone you know.